Hi, and welcome to another Austin Software's cooperative meetup. This will be the last meetup of the year for when we'll be meeting again in 2023. The ending book review today is going to be over Guilds in the Middle Ages by George Renard, and looking at how guilds are related to software cooperatives and how things work there and what we can learn from them. Watson's going to go through a mind map and we can have a discussion about the book and topics. All right, Watson, you ready?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share this mind map as well. Totally forgot to do that in the chat. All right. Guilds in the Middle Ages. So we shared that we're going to review this book a bit late. So I don't know how much people were able to look at it. It's about 150-ish pages. It's in the public domain. It was written in 1918 by George Renard. It's about the guilds, obviously. And so this was sparked by the union books that we were reading previously, because there were some references to guilds. So there is a relationship. The author here says there isn't a direct lineage between the unions and guilds, although people normally think that. So at least this author denies that. So let's jump in. There's a bunch to cover. I think guilds and cooperatives have a bunch of overlap. Guilds and unions have a bunch of overlap. So we're going to jump right in. This author also, as far as some context, this book was part of a bigger piece where he goes from guilds into his second book was about unions. So in the right around 1910, 1920, when the author was writing, he started writing about I guess the current unions and all that. And that was when that's in the heyday of unions in the United States. So I haven't read that book, but yeah, he really did his research here, and it was a follow-up. And I think his main thing was to really lean into the unions. So is there any questions about guilds or the book in general that people want to ask right now before I jump in? Okay. So one of the other books that we reviewed, Peter Kropotkin, Mutual Aid, talks a lot about guilds. That's another one that sparked this. So as far as an organic camaraderie of workers, the formation of some type of coalition, the Mutual Aid book kind of pointed to that, and it talked about Europe, but it also talked about Russia as well, and speculated about other continents like Asia and Africa. So this book is another deep dive into the guilds that I think would be more, I guess this book is more of the person's considered more of an expert on guilds. So we're going to take a look. And then I will say at the outset, what I'm looking at is the where kind of some type of organic coalition of worker like formation is represented in guilds. So we'll get into it, but just like Kropotkin was saying, there were certain cities that were considered free cities, where really the formation of the guilds were, as far as this author is concerned, were organic. And then there were other cities where it seemed like the formation of the guilds happened in tandem with feudalism and under the I don't know, the guise of feudalism, or the, I don't know, kind of the overview of feudalism, or in spite of feudalism. So there's two different stories there. And but it happened. And this author is really concerned with Paris and France. Whereas, but he does talk about Italy and England as well. I will say for what we're concerned with, I would say that we're concerned with more of what he calls the free cities, which would be, I guess, Florence, and there's some other cities, but I think Florence is one to take a deep dive on and to see the maturity from the beginning all the way to the end of the age of the guilds. So let's go ahead and jump into the introduction. Medieval guilds assumed many different forms under the varying circumstances of their origin in Holland, Italy, France, England, Scotland, Germany, but underlying all their different manifestations, a fundamental identity of principle can be found. For in all, the direct control of industry was in the hands of the associated producers. So producers being workers. Okay, so let's make this a little bit bigger. Industry was carried on under a system of enterprise at a public and private, associative and individual. The unit of production was the workshop of the individual master craftsman, but the craftsman held his position as a master only by virtue of the membership in his craft guild. He was not free to adopt any methods of production or any scale of production he might choose. He was subjected to an elaborate regulation of both the quantity and quality of products, of the price at which he should charge the consumer, and of his relations to the journeyman and apprentice. So we're going to talk about the guilds have 3 levels: master, journeyman, and apprentice. It's interesting to try to compare that to, I guess, modern times, where people are kind of assumed to go from, you could say, high school into college and into their workforce. And there's some type of stage where you're getting some type of training where you're able to be productive. The apprenticeship stage was in the guild era. That's when you were becoming productive, and that could be somewhere around age, I don't know, 12, 14, up into age 20. And then you become a journeyman, where you are working under a master. But one of the things that he's talking about in the introduction here, so that you have these 3 tiers. The master doesn't one thing people may have, uh, through intuition or what have you, they may think of a guild master as someone that can do whatever they want. Actually, there was an elaborate system of rules that was kind of negotiated with other, let's say, shops in the guild, and then they couldn't violate those rules, so they would get fined if they were to violate. So this was kind of a limiting factor for masters. And so it's counterintuitive, as people kind of think a master guildsman would be able to do whatever they want. So the guild was internally self-regulating unit, laying down the conditions under which production was to be carried on, and occupied a recognized status in the community based on performance of certain communal functions. It was not, however, wholly independent and self-contained. It had intimate relations with other guilds, with the municipal authority of the town in which it was situated, and in increasing measure with the national state within whose area it lay. So there, the book, the author continues to, or continuously goes between the rules of the guild and what the regulations that it tried to lay out, and the municipality. So you could call it the state, you can call it the lord of the city or what have you. There's different phases between the city and then the nation. It was kind of a niche negotiation between the craft, the guild masters, and the municipality, or the lawmakers, let's say. So we'll get into it, but there was always this interplay of, how do you enforce rules? Through, whether it be through some type of boycott, or just essentially the guild refuses to do business with you, to the guild literally enforces. The guild kind of acts as a state, so they have the threat of force behind them, where they enforce their regulations within a city. They offload the threat of force onto the city, or offload it onto the nation, which kind of commissions something on the level of the city where they are enforcing rules. So it can be a little confusing, but it's quite interesting to me where some of this negotiation, some of how the power it unfolds on the city level and the state level. So I will say on the outset that the book does a deep dive into how power was distributed on the city level, because evidently from, say, the 12th century up into the 15th century, it was in varying different, different, what we know of now as, countries. The city level was where the power lay. And then up until like the 15th century, the author says that that's when the nation state started to take more interest in power, economic power, and so on and so forth. So 12th century, so around then, the cities, the formation of cities, they were acting as what we would think of as what countries act like now. So the guilds would try to enforce certain rules, and then they would create bigger and bigger councils. And then there would be, let's say, if you were to hone in on, say, Florence of Italy, they would have this great council at the top end of the city that would enforce rules or create edicts for rules and so on and so forth that all the guilds would follow or agree to, and then the guilds would enforce. Um, so let's see. There's the author talks a little bit about there's really kind of a separation within guilds where if we make it to it, there's kind of a horizontal and vertical separation where you have what you would call merchants, which may do more of the trading and maybe even like taking things from downstream and selling them upstream. So going from one city to another kind of thing. And then you had the ones that were concentrated within the city, within one craft. So let's say a metalsmith guild or tailoring guild, uh, and or stone, like a woodworking guild, or you know, craft, something like a stone guild or a cathedral. I don't want to say cathedral building guild, but one that works with stone to build different buildings and things like that. And so those were separate, and there was a power struggle between those, and how that power struggle between the workers and you could call the master guilds, and then the different power struggles between the types of guilds played out is important in kind of, I would say, to go bring it back to cooperatives, the negotiation between workers within a profession and classes within a profession, and then other professions, other domains. So we can learn some lessons from that as well. Let's see here. There's a lot within the book. There's a lot of regulation. So we'll get into it, but the guilds were really preoccupied with trying to make things on one side fair, another side efficient. So the fair side might be counterintuitive, but they were really preoccupied with honor. So if you were a craftsman and you were trying to demonstrate your elite home or cathedral or stone building skills or metalworking skills, so on and so forth, there was something about the prestige and this honor that comes from what you build it was beyond just money, and it would allow you to have more power. And we'll probably talk about it, but the power allowed for more, I would argue, autonomy within their worldview or within their world. So there's a hierarchy of guilds as well that was formed because of the power of the different professions of the guilds. So in this introduction, he really does the overview of how the guilds started. They rose, they had their heyday, and they fell really under multiple different reasons. But one of the big takeaways is because of the kind of international trade, and they couldn't they failed to adapt for many different reasons, what he calls external reasons and internal reasons. But the international trade was a killer for the major guilds. So I would say uh, there, as far as an overview, there's really two types of guilds. There are what you would call the smaller craft guilds, and then there's the big commerce or manufacturing guilds. The big guilds are really the precursors to what we would call just capitalism, big capital holders. Uh, those guilds were like banking guilds and the big merchant guilds that would trade between countries, kind of thing. And so they had all the incentives that were in line with what we would think now of what international corporations would have. Smaller guilds were about workers. So that's really kind of a high level overview of the book. So anybody have any questions so far?
No questions. Very interesting.
Yeah. These first chapters were pretty small. So he's talking about here like some of the origin of the guilds. It's really kind of mysterious. There's multiple theories. The first theory, they were the persistence of the earlier institutions that but what were these institutions? Some say that they were particularly in the south of France. They were the Roman and Byzantine origin, and they were derived from those collegia of poor classes, which in the last centuries of the empire chiefly concerned themselves with the provision of funerals. So this is talking about the Romans, really, or again from the scholae, the official and compulsory groups, which, keeping with the name of the hall in which their councils assembled, prolonged their existence till about the year 1000. This is really talking about heritage from Rome. According to others, they're particularly in the north of German origin. They were derived from the associations resembling artificial families, members of which mingled their blood and exchanged vows to help each other under certain definite circumstances. Or again, they may have descended in a straight line from the ministeriales, the feudal servitors who, in every royal or feudal domain of any extent, were grouped according to their trade and under the authority of the pantere, a head farrier or a chief herdsman. So okay, so in according to the opposite theory, each guild was a separate creation born, as it were, by spontaneous generation and had no connection with the past. Associations, scholae, colleges had been killed by the hostility of the central power before they had time to mature fully. They were children of necessity, was compelled the weak to unite for mutual defense in order to remedy the disorders and abuses of which they were victims. They were a result of great associative movement, which, working by turns on political and economic lines, first gave birth to the communes and so created social environment. This is going to be a Kropotkin view. So then we can see the different views here, which is good to, take an opposite side here. All right. That's the first chapter. Let's get into the second, the organization of the guilds. This, I'm going to just tell you offhand, is going to talk about what we said, the master, journeyman, and apprentice. Let's just, as far as a high level, because we got a lot to get into. There were, I can just tell you offhand, there were on one side, some of the guild formation was, it could be democratic, it could be very much top down and imposed. So you had both. And it changed from the 12th century right into the 17th century between how the power was distributed. The apprentice was, so you had the apprentice, you had the journeyman, and you had the masters. The masters trained the apprentice, they took on apprentices, and it could last between 1 year to 7 years. In the beginning, where so the incentive system, how it was set up was you were, you as an apprentice, you joined on, you didn't really get paid, but you got room and board, and you had to be selected, but you were trained by, a master, one with prestige within that. We'll go ahead and say a city. So it was an honor to be selected, and that's really, sometimes they paid into it and sometimes they didn't, as far as the families and so on and so forth. So people could show promise, or they can just be selected, or what have you. This was in the beginning. It later became, so after a couple, 300 years or so, it started, the oligarchs started forming. There started hereditary concerns were, started being implemented. So it started being bloodline. People were pulling in their apprentices that would be, it's kind of a nepotism thing that started happening. But in the beginning, the incentive system was based on, if you were to join and you were to work hard, your goal was to become a master, which at first was completely not hereditary. It wasn't locked in. There wasn't all types of hoops you had to jump through. That's kind of the the uh, the steps and the progression of how the guild system worked. And it's also kind of the how the down it played into the downfall of the guilds. So when people started thinking that it was useless to try to become a master in the guild, they started saying that people in the middle, which were called the journeymen, they were really the bulk of the workforce. They started saying, like, hey, let's create coalitions for our own interests. And this is when you started having the infighting. Let's see here. So, like I was saying, the guild, when simple, let's make this a bit bigger, was usually half democratic, being a bourgeois growth developing in feudal surroundings. It rested, like the feudal system itself, on two closely connected principles: hierarchy and equality. So that's this battle between these three. I wouldn't even say three tiers. It really was two tiers, because apprentices had no power. But the journeymen and the masters, that's really where things were going. Let's see here. So, yeah, like I was saying, inequality could be theoretically at least only temporary. Since the master had once been a journeyman, the journeyman was a prospective master, and the apprentice in his turn would climb to the top of the ladder, right? So this is all kind of the game, and it seemed to set up a progression that allowed people to build some of these early coalitions that not only allowed them to kind of build, again, this author talks about it, but the Mutual Kropotkin talks about it, to really come into their own with craftsmanship on everything that created the magnificent, like you could call it magnificent or beautiful cities in Europe, the craftsmanship that was going on there between the 12th century and the 17th century. um, and you know, that built the incentives for the guilds to compete and to try to do some of these beautiful works of art and so on and so forth. In the end, of course, it became, because people started thinking that these incentive systems were not really realistic anymore, or they're not obtainable anymore, started to break down. So kind of the incentive systems seemed to be fruitful and obtainable, and then I guess in the end they started to be, over a course of 300 years, they started to be looked at as not obtainable. But there's a lot also involved with this, where these guilds are embedded in the workings of the politics of the city. And we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. Let's see. Let's talk about apprentices. So the apprentice was, as may be imagined, the object of a somewhat keen solicitude. Apprenticeship in small industry. So like I was saying, there's big guilds and small guilds. In the beginning, they were all small. All the crafts were small, and some of them lent themselves to becoming big. So what's big? Well, we'll get into the different power structures of the different guilds later, but the big was, it could be size, so the manufacturing guilds, and that controlled a lot of workers, but then also wealth, so the bankers guilds were the ones that had more power as well. So apprenticeship in the small industry, with which it was intimately associated, was the means of maintaining the professional skill on which the guild prided itself. The apprentice was a child whom his parent or guardians wished to be taught a trade as soon as he was 10 or 12 years of age. Although there was no fixed age limit, a master was found who would take him. Every instructor must be a master. He must also be of good life and character, endowed with patience, and approved of by the officers of the guild. If he were recognized as capable of carrying out his duties, the two parties bound themselves by a contract, often verbal, often also made before a notary. This fixed the length of the apprenticeship, which varied greatly in different trades, for it might cover from 1 to 6, 8, 10, or 12 years. Sometimes it's stipulated for a time of probation, usually a fortnight, during which either side could cancel agreement. So a couple of counterintuitive things in here. The master had to be approved by officers sometimes, and there were sometimes so there's verbal contracts, sometimes before a notary, no fixed age limit. Some of those things you wouldn't think of as people kind of think of guilds as the master can do whatever they want. No, there was elaborate rules for all this stuff, and people could not just do whatever they wanted. There's all types of little interesting things between the master and apprentice. I don't know, let's see one in here. There were rules on how the master could correct and beat the apprentice, that type of thing, and then the master could be penalized for beating them for no reason, that kind of thing. Yeah, so apprentices were, between the devil and the deep sea. They suffered from the jealousy of the journeymen. So the workers were kind of thinking the masters having them they'd rather assign work to an apprentice instead of having the journeyman do it. The journeymen are going to be more expensive, right? So that there was that interplay. And of course, they had to deal with, all they're getting is just food and shelter. So then we have the journeymen. Their future masters or else workmen for life. So not every journeyman became a master. Unable to set up for themselves because they lacked the indispensable wherewithal, as certain statutes crudely express it. Their time of apprenticeship is over. They remained with the master for whom they lived, or else, especially in the building trades, having perfected themselves by travel, they went to the market for disengaged hands and offered their services. They were hired in certain places where the unemployed of all trades assembled. They were required to give proof that they were free of all other engagements and to present certificates not only of capability, but of good conduct signed by their last master. So the rules for the journeyman are pretty elaborate. Lot of regulations that stop them from being competed with from people outside of the city. They had to have certificates, like it's saying here, approved by a master. They had to be, if there's some type of arrangement where they were doing work for people outside of the master, which is, I want to say, was rare. They had to get permission. Lots of arrangements there, and lots of fines to be passed around there. So for a journeyman to leave work voluntarily at normal time, so this is during the day, was strictly forbidden. And the police took up and provisioned any idlers or vagabonds found wandering in the towns. But even in those days, Monday was often taken as an unauthorized holiday. Wow, that's interesting. Certain crafts had their regular dead session, thus at Paris, among the bucklers, makers of brass buckles, the valets were dismissed during the month of August. So you had all these types of different rules about vacation time, so on and so forth. There's someone in some places in here when they're talking about the days were like 12-hour days, and then they would have their, like it's saying here, maybe Monday was the vacation. They had different rules back then. It's lots of this. So in the year 2080, the combination of workmen is clearly defined as an offense. So this combination of workmen would be like a union. Any alliance against common profit, when any class of persons pledge themselves, undertake, or covenant not to work at so low a wage as before, and so raise the wages of their own authority, agree not to work for less, and combine to put constraint or threats on the companions who will not enter into their alliance. The attempt to raise wages by combination was condemned under the pretext that it would make everything dearer, and was punished by the Lord by fine and imprisonment. So again, talking about the different places, there were free cities and there were cities that were under a lord. Oftentimes, with the as far as the power, the way the power is distributed, the lords and the very powerful masters in arrangement with the lords, who gave them paid a tax to the lord. So the lord is somebody that's like they're the ones that took over a certain plot of land, a certain city, whatever, and they're the ones with the physical might. They have knights and all this stuff like that. They would kind of have this game between them and the people in power, where they would allow for some of these rules to be in place to keep the regular workers in line. And so one of them, masters were like, hey, you can't come together and try to go on strike or anything like that. We're going to make it illegal for you. So there's
anti-union movements and stuff early is what it sounds like.
Yes, it goes right on. He goes right from this type of stuff right into unions. It's just, there's no break. It goes right into the combat with unions. So I will go and say at the end of we get to the death of the guilds, and the end of the guilds and the death of the guilds, they were made illegal. You couldn't, this rule here, this is in 2080. So all rules like this they weren't all over Europe all at the same time. Some places were more free, some places were less free. And they tried to establish these rules, and there was just fights, like literal killing each other over rules like this. But in the end, they started to be in unison forbidden. So you couldn't, as a worker, the first there was the workers forbidden, and then the whole thing with a guild altogether. Guilds were forbidden, like illegal. Like you would be either sent to prison or killed for trying to create guilds. And that's where people kind of say unions are the new guilds, because unions were had laws forbidding them, all types of things like that too. It's basically the same thing, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I mean, do you have another comment?
No, it's just interesting to see, how far back and how deep, and
Yeah.
just rules made by someone else, and then you point to it and say there's a law and there's a rule, so we need to follow it because there's a law and a rule. But where did it start, and why is it there, and why should we agree?
Yeah.
Um,
And the thing that's good about this is seeing how the rules get made. So I mean, this is an overview of the book, but he's really gets down in the weeds with saying that this law was made by these people in Paris or London, France, Germany, wherever, by this guild, where they essentially what we would call lobbying now, before the Lord or whoever. If it was a free town, they would themselves institute it, saying, okay, now you as a worker, so the journeyman or whatever, we're going to reduce your power this way. And they would have some rationale. It wouldn't be just, we want to make you less powerful. It would be something that would seem more legitimate, kind of thing. So let's go. This is interesting. So women were not excluded from guild life in many towns. Above all, those were entry into a guild conferred political rights and imposed military duties. The women could not become masters. So in certain towns, everybody in the guild was also in the military, so they defended the town from other towns. The cities would fight each other and stuff like that. So think of cities as like their nations. In those towns, they would be like, okay, you can't be a guild master in those towns. But the ones where it wasn't like that, they could be guild masters. So I want to say some of these weaving guilds and some of the other ones they had, he was talking about that they have guild masters were women, which is totally counter to me. I would think that they didn't have that back then. So I said, the other side of talking about guilds, there's the small guilds and there's a big guild. So he's calling the great commercial and industrial guilds. Profound in those guilds, profound inequalities appear, and they do not disappear with time. Whether we deal with the bankers or the drapers guilds, we found that their organization is already founded on the capitalist system. The masters, often grouped together in companies, are great personages, rich tradesmen, influential politicians, separated from those they employ by a deep and permanent gulf. This is where you have just a big difference between how power is distributed in the types of professions. And this is where, I mean, one way to think of it now would be verticals. So the banking vertical, and other ones. So he's going to get into it. I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but there are, as far as how the power distribution went down, I'll try to hurry up and get to it, but there's different rationale for who was powerful within a craft guild, and then within that power, who is it, that was elected to councils that would make these rules we're talking about. And those rules, like regulations. And then they were able to kind of game the system to make it to where they're preoccupied with their own heritage and so on and so forth, or their own profession or whatever. All right. Let's go ahead and go to the next chapter. So that was chapter 2. We're only making it chapter. So this administration of the guilds. The guild was a voluntary association of men carrying on the same trade or allied trades and pledging themselves by oath to defend their common interests. It demanded of those who, in virtue of their mastership, wished to belong to it, proofs of capability, morality, orthodoxy, political loyalty, and often regular payment of contribution. So this is a kind of thing that might not be intuitive. When people think of guilds, they think of just working on a craft, but there are all these other things of capability, morality, and all these other things. So no act of importance pledging the whole guild could be carried without the advice and ratification of the assembly. So like I said before, some of these assemblies could be democratic. Some of them were not so democratic. They're basically power based. And let's get over to 4. Let's see how 4. So this is a guild, what the essence of a guild and how it operated, and the rationale of why people would say, let's build this coalition. This is where I would say cooperatives come into play. Like there's the overlap and some things that we could learn. So the other chapters, there's a bunch where we could learn from there too. But so let's see here. The guilds appear to have 3 essential aims: an economic aim, a social and moral aim, and a political aim. So let's see the economic aim. The guild was first and foremost a fighting organization for the defense of the trade interest of those who belong to it. So it was really about workers and the craft. And it was jealous of the welfare and the honor of the craft. So it's concerned with that. The guild prided itself on letting nothing leave its shops but finished products, perfect of their kind. They examined and stamped every article, and further required that it should be have a special trademark stating where it was made and its just price. So all those became regulations. So it's an interesting thing is on the macro when we're thinking about, I'm sorry, on the micro, thinking about quality in a cooperative, and if you don't put something out that's of quality enough, it could be you turn customers away and they upset you, or they're upset or whatever, or it could be you could get sued or whatever, right? You're not delivering what you need to deliver. And then there's marketing involved and all that stuff. All of that is already been argued about 500 years ago within guilds. And they through just iterations of having to deal with trying to get someone to purchase something and talking about the validity and the value of a thing and the integrity of a craft and so on and so forth, competition, they started making rules about it. So where this was part of the competition between shops within a guild. So let's say tailors, right? The different tailors within a guild saying, hey, you're putting stuff out there that's making it to where the people in the city don't want to buy anything. That kind of thing. Or people from other traders coming in from other cities coming in here, they're saying that, we all are bad at making suits or what have you, you need to step your game up, that kind of thing. They would make rules on having a minimum level of quality. That's some of the natural incentives, the organic incentives that made the guilds and made the regulations within the guild. So it wasn't like a power struggle, top down type of setting up rules. These rules were organic. So that was the small guilds. So in the great commerce guilds, they regulated the conditions which made a bargain valid. The duty of paying the person that's that's making the purchase, it's called the denier due, and the earnest money, the regular term for completing the payment, the rate of discount, and the transparent methods of avoiding the ban placed on interest by the church, and the methods of bookkeeping, and so on and so forth. So these, when it came to like the bigger guilds, they had a bunch of rules that they would enforce as well. Yeah, so this is one of the downfalls of guilds. One serious result of a constant and perfectly legitimate effort to assure the success of the guilds was that it produced a strong desire to reduce, or if possible, do away with competition. This is what he calls in his chapter about the kind of the downfall of some of the guilds and the imperfections. Was there were things about that reduced competition. They were also pretty hostile sometimes to innovation. So if there were things that made the workers not as useful, they would make a regulation to stop it. One of the author goes so far as to say the printing press might have been made 200, 300 years earlier, because there were the beginnings of someone making a printing press. And they made it illegal. So they're on some stages, they were pretty hostile to innovation. Doing trading that wasn't that wasn't approved. If you look at this law here in the Venetian, so this is Italy. If a workman carry into another country any art or craft to the detriment of the republic, he will be ordered to return. If he disobeys, his nearest relatives would be imprisoned in order that the solidarity of the family may persuade him to return. If he persists in his disobedience, secret measures will be taken to have him killed. Right. So they as far as how serious they were, and then their methods, they weren't playing around. Everything that says when you're reading this book, I would say pay attention to anything that says the free towns. So I would say Florence would be the example. So Florence was exceptionally organic until the end. They didn't have a king or lord until, I don't know, the 1600s or something, that was doing a top-down regulation. So those were the ones where I would say the overlap with cooperatives would be pretty easy to look at. Yeah. So that as far as the economic aims, you really get the gist. And then I'm gonna try to blast through these other two, and then we can call it. So moral and social aims. The second ruling idea of guild statutes was the pursuit of moral and social aims that desired to establish between the masters of which it was composed of honest competition and fair play. So it desired to prevent the great from crushing the small, the rich from ruining the poor, and in order to succeed, it tried to make advantages and charges equal for all. Its motto so far was solidarity. So that, from the outset, with a 3-tier system. By the way, the Gilded Age had less inequality than we do in the United States right now. Just as a side tangent, but they were concerned about fairness in the beginning, and it grew into the point to where it was less and less. They had they had rules around how the competition, and there were different games you could play as far as buying up raw materials. So let's just say you make, you're a carpenter, you go in and, the people who are cutting down the trees in the forest, whatever, you go and buy up the lumber or whatever. And that would make it to where the other carpenters don't have the raw materials. That would be unfair. They would have rules about that, regulations about that. Different cities, they might set up a joint, what we could call a cooperative now, but a joint purchasing unit that would buy everything up and then distribute it between the craft guilds and the shops to make it more fair. So this part there was a lot of fairness and distribution of raw materials. Was a big part what he's talking about here. And there was a lot of, so you had the struggle between the masters within one guild, so different shops within a guild, and then you had between domains. So you could call haberdasheries, which were kind of like people who sold everything, doctors, barbers, which were united. They both kind of did surgeries back then. And then you had bankers and so on and so forth. There's a morality of trying to equalize the power between. And so this was kind of a part of the struggle that was going on, and they were concerned. There was also, I don't see here, but basically there were charges to help the poor of the city. So the doctors had to have hospitals, and this has a heritage up until modern times. So the hospitals had to serve the poor. There were communes of the people who would, you could say bakers or whoever, but people that where they would get fines, where they violated certain regulations. Those fines were used to serve the poor in different stages. So food, shelter, hospitals, those types of things, visitors to the city, so on and so forth. And that's part of the morality portion. And then you had the politics. So I'll say from the outset, in the free cities, the guilds were, you could separate between the two. You had the cities that weren't what I would call the free cities. So they had a lord, they had somebody who they had to answer to as far as having control, having power, state power, threat of violence, that type of thing. And then there were the free cities who didn't have that, and the people who would institute like protection of the city and all that were the guilds. Those are the two ways to look at it. They both had to deal with politics. And so this is after, feudalism. So within the cities that had lords, kings, so on and so forth, those cities were those municipalities, those monarchs, they were in negotiation with the guilds. The guilds were able to create wealth better than, let's say, the old feudalistic system where the king was actually in charge of some peasants to go ahead and do farming and so on and so forth. They were like, oh, well, these guilds, these tailors, so on and so forth, they're actually better at the economy or whatever. So I'm just going to take a tax from them. So there was a negotiation between through the economic power of the guilds within these types of cities and the monarchs or the state power. And so they would institute lots of rules, so on and so forth, and try to create regulations for themselves, for the city and all that. Then the monarchs would have regulations for them. In the free cities, it was a council. Say Florence is a good example. The council would be elected by the different guilds in or kind of a pecking order of power. So and we're not going to get to it, but there was different levels of prestige. So there was the prestige of knowledge. So let's say doctors, bankers, anything to do with finance, that type of thing. They had power in the kind of a knowledge component, and then there was a historical component, and then there was a kind of a wealth component. So bankers, the big merchant guilds, the great commerce guilds, what he calls them, so the manufacturers, so on and so forth, they had tremendous power, and then they would elect certain people to councils. And then historically, if you were a type of profession that came late to the game within that 300-year period, you're going to have less power. You didn't have the history of being prestigious. Sometimes people think of the craft guilds, the art guilds of, let's think of Michelangelo or somebody like that. It's being powerful, and they weren't. They were definitely secondary. So somebody that was into music or art or any of that stuff, they were very much not as powerful as the rest of the guilds. So political aim that lent itself into who is it that was making these rules, doing these negotiations, and so on and so forth. Like I was saying, these public services, they had to guarantee certain taking care of the sick, poor, and hospitals, all that stuff like that. And then you have it's interesting to talk about some of these dates, because again, it was like over a 300-year period where you had the rise and fall of these guilds, and how they didn't really, between these different cities, they didn't really communicate with each other and how to operate, like to the extent of, no one could control one another, but they all emerged with some of the same structure as far as guilds, crafts, and all that stuff across Europe, and with Kropotkin talking about, even Russia. So yeah, that I think when talking about cooperatives, we would want to include, when you're thinking about the essence of a cooperative, these three: the economics for them, the moral aim, and then also the political aim. So I think we should probably stop here because we're at an hour, and then maybe we'll go ahead and have another session here, because so we're at chapter 4. Chapter 5, the merits and defects. This lends itself well to cooperatives. 6, the causes of decay. There was a lot in here that I think could be avoided, that we have to look at, because these lessons were a lot of things that we struggle with are already there. But does anybody have any questions?